looked at other studios in the Clive Davis Institute, and I'd like you to tell me a little bit about what makes this setup different. You know, this is a Neve 8078,
That's
right?
correct.
A lot of history there,
Absolutely.
a lot of idiosyncrasies, I'm sure, in
Sure.
terms of rebuilding this thing. Can you tell me a little bit about the console and the setup?
Sure. Yeah. This board Adam purchased in 2012, and it was at that point in Santa Monica. So we went out there to decommission it. Myself and Andre Kelman, who was the engineer at Oscilloscope, went out there to decommission it and bring it back to New York. But the history of the console, it's kind of a bi-coastal console. It was on the East Coast in the early part of its life, and then went over to the West Coast. So this console, I believe, was first sold to Ronnie Millsap, went on to A&R, went on to Cove Sound, then ended up at Sony Studio D, and I think a lot of New York engineers would know this board from Sony at Studio D. Sony had an incredible engineering technical staff, so the board was really well maintained. It's always been in a professional environment. It moved from the New York City Sony facility to the Santa Monica Sony facility, and then ultimately the Threshold studios in Santa Monica, where we decommissioned it and brought it back to New York for Oscilloscope. So the good news is the board has always been very well maintained. There's always been top-notch techs taking care of it. We're grateful to be counted amongst their number, and we got to recondition the board before it went into Oscilloscope. So it had a full kind of refresh. At that point, we put hundreds of hours of work into making sure it would maintain its reliability and usability. Vintage consoles are great, but you don't want to deal with a vintage console that's intermittent or problematic. Anything that slows down workflow is counterproductive, takes you out of the process of making records. So we felt pretty strongly, and Yauk did as well, that the board should be as close to performing like a new console as possible, even though it's a 40-year-old console. So a lot of work went into bringing the board to this point, both at Sony and at Oscilloscope.
Yeah, I as I look at the board, we talked to Bob Power about a more modern board. Can you talk to me a little bit about the setup on this on this Neve board and how it sounds? It might be a little different than some of the other boards in the space.
Sure, absolutely. I think there's two major categories of what might make this board a little different than boards that came after it. One is the style of the circuitry and the build quality. This is a console that's most of the designs are based around the use of transformers, and it's let me try and simplify this. Hold on. Most of the circuit designs are based around the use of transformers. It's a very euphonic sounding console. The EQs are very musical, more than they are, say, surgical. And it doesn't have a ton of bells and whistles. So on a board like this, we would say the signal path is very short, meaning that you're not going through a ton of electronics from the input to your final output. As consoles get more complicated, and there's more bells and whistles added, there's more circuitry to achieve that. A lot of boards become transformer-less, which is fine, but it's a different sound. And you end up going through a lot more circuitry between point A and point B. I think this board gives you everything you need to work and not a whole lot extra. So once you get used to that, once you get used to the functionality of the console, it's actually very streamlined. And I think for today's workflows, it fits really well, because a lot of the more complicated large format consoles, SSLs being the most popular, were trying to achieve things in routing and functionality that were necessary at the time, that I think a lot of engineers and producers are able to do in Pro Tools if they really want to jump through those hoops. So the fact that this board's maybe a little more simplified in its functionality is not so much of a detriment nowadays. It's really about the sonics of the board. Neve 80 series consoles sound unique. It's a recognizable sound. It's for people who love them, it's exciting to work on them because it gives you back a lot sonically. It's very rewarding in that regard. So